Tonight, we embark on a journey to the frozen north, to explore the legendary world of the Vikings. A world of towering fjords, stormy seas, and endless horizons, where fearless warriors set sail into the unknown, where myths of gods and monsters shaped the way people lived, and where an age of adventure changed history forever. For many, the word Viking brings to mind fierce raiders, helmeted warriors wielding axes, storming villages, and sailing longships under dark skies. But the Vikings were far more than just raiders. They were explorers who reached distant lands long before others. They were master shipbuilders who crafted vessels unlike anything the world had ever seen. They were merchants and traders, bringing goods across vast distances. They were poets, telling epic sagas of gods, heroes, and lost kingdoms. They were farmers, craftsmen, and rulers who shaped history in ways we are still uncovering today. The Viking Age, stretching from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was a time of movement and transformation. The people of Scandinavia, what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, did not call themselves Vikings as we think of them today. To them, Viking was more of an activity than an identity. To go Viking meant to embark on a journey, to seek fortune, adventure, or conquest beyond the seas. Some left home to raid, others to trade, and many to settle in new lands where they built thriving communities. But who were these people, really? What was life like in the cold, rugged landscapes of Scandinavia? What did they believe? What did they eat? How did they survive the harsh winters, and what drove them to set sail for lands unknown? Tonight, we will explore their world. We will sail across icy waters on longships, standing among Viking warriors as they prepare for battle. We will sit by the fire in a Viking longhouse, where stories of gods and giants are whispered under the glow of flickering torches. We will wander through bustling Viking marketplaces, filled with traders selling furs, spices, and silver. We will uncover lost settlements, mysterious artifacts, and the hidden truths behind the Viking myths. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift to a time long ago. A time of explorers and legends, of storms and sagas, of gods and warriors. The echoes of the Viking Age still whisper through the fjords, carried on the cold northern winds. And now, we begin our journey. Our journey begins in the lands of the far north, where icy winds sweep across towering fjords, and deep forests stretch for miles beneath the endless sky. This is Scandinavia, the homeland of the Vikings. A rugged, untamed land shaped by the elements, where summers are short, and winters are long and unforgiving. It was in this harsh and beautiful landscape that the Vikings were born, forged by nature's challenges into strong, resilient people. The lands of the Vikings. The Viking world was divided among three great regions: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each land had its own unique character. Norway was a land of towering mountains and deep fjords, where farmers carved out a living along narrow coastlines and seafarers braved the wild northern seas. Sweden was a land of dense forests and winding rivers, where traders followed the great waterways that led deep into the heart of Europe. Denmark, with its rolling green fields and sheltered harbors, became a center of trade and power, a gateway between the north and the wider world. Despite their differences, these lands shared a common culture, bound together by language, traditions, and the ever-present influence of the sea. For the Vikings, the sea was both a highway and a lifeline, connecting distant settlements, carrying traders to foreign shores, and providing food in times of need. A society of warriors, farmers, and traders. Contrary to the common image of Vikings as warriors, most were not raiders or conquerors. The majority of people in Viking society were farmers, tending to their crops and livestock in small villages scattered across the land. Others were skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, and weavers, creating everything from finely crafted swords to intricate jewelry. Some were traders, traveling to distant lands to barter for silver, spices, and silk. But Viking society was also highly structured, divided into three main classes: the Jarls, Carls, and Thralls. At the top were the Jarls, the noble chieftains and rulers, men of great wealth and influence who commanded warriors and ruled over villages. They lived in large, richly decorated longhouses, surrounded by warriors and advisors. Some Jarls led great Viking fleets on raids, while others ruled vast territories, building alliances through trade and diplomacy. Below them were the Kols, the free men and women who made up the majority of Viking society. Farmers, blacksmiths, shipbuilders, and merchants, these were the backbone of the Viking world. A Carl could own land, raise a family, and even gain wealth and power through skill and bravery. Many Kols became warriors, joining Viking raiding parties or defending their homes against rival clans. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves, captured in raids or born into servitude. Thralls worked the fields, built ships, and served in the households of the jarls and Kols. But unlike in many other societies, some thralls could earn their freedom through hard work or by being granted release by their masters. Despite their differences in status, all Vikings shared a strong sense of community, bound together by traditions, laws, and the ever-present challenges of survival. The Thing, the Viking assembly. Viking society was not ruled by kings alone. They had a unique form of government known as the Thing, a great assembly where free men would gather to make laws, settle disputes, and decide matters of war and peace. Held in open-air meeting places, often near sacred sites, the Thing was a place of debate and decision-making. Chieftains and warriors spoke their minds, laws were read aloud, and justice was carried out. In some ways, the Thing was an early form of democracy, where even common men had a voice. But Viking justice could be harsh. If a man was found guilty of serious crimes, he could be exiled, declared an outlaw, forced to leave his home and wander the wilderness, cut off from the protection of society. For a Viking, to be outlawed was often a fate worse than death. The Viking Longhouse, life in the north. At the heart of Viking life was the Longhouse, a great wooden hall where families lived, worked, and gathered around the fire. Longhouses were built from timber, with thick walls to keep out the cold and thatched roofs to protect against the heavy snow. Inside, a central hearth provided warmth and light, its flickering flames casting shadows on the wooden beams above. In the evenings, families would sit together, eating hearty meals of bread, fish, and roasted meats. Children would listen to the elders tell stories of gods and heroes, their voices rising and falling with the crackle of the fire. Warriors sharpened their weapons, preparing for the battles to come. And outside, the cold northern wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant call of wolves. For the Vikings, the Longhouse was more than just a home. It was a place of safety, a gathering place for the community, and a symbol of strength and resilience in a harsh and unforgiving land. The role of women in Viking society. Unlike in many other medieval cultures, Viking women had a surprising degree of freedom and influence. They could own land, inherit property, and even seek divorce if their marriages were unhappy. Some Viking women became powerful rulers, like the legendary Queen Lagertha, a shield maiden said to have fought alongside her warriors in battle. Women managed households, oversaw farms while their husbands were away at sea, and played a crucial role in the survival of their families. Some even wielded great political power, acting as advisors or leaders in their communities. Viking sagas tell of women who commanded ships, led warriors into battle, and left their mark on history. And so, the world of the Vikings begins to take shape. A land of warriors and farmers, rulers and craftsmen. A people who thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, bound together by their traditions, their laws, and their endless drive to explore and conquer the unknown. But our journey has only just begun. Ahead, we will set sail with Viking explorers, navigating uncharted waters, discovering distant lands, and uncovering the secrets of their legendary longships. The sea was everything to the Vikings. It was their path, their challenge, their escape. It was the road to adventure, to riches, and to power. The sound of the waves, the scent of salt on the wind, these were the rhythms of Viking life. It was said that a true Viking was born with the sea in their blood, and for centuries, they looked out toward the horizon, wondering what lay beyond. But what drove them to leave their lands? Why did they risk everything to set sail into the unknown? To understand this, we must return to the world of the Viking homelands, to a time when life was harsh and the future uncertain. The pressures of home, why the Vikings left. Scandinavia was a land of beauty, but also a land of struggle. The fjords were deep, the forests thick, and the winters long. Land was scarce, and as villages grew, so too did the need for new resources. For many, there was simply not enough farmland to go around. Sons who would not inherit their father's lands had little choice but to seek fortune elsewhere. And so, they turned to the sea. But it was not just hunger for land that sent the Vikings across the waves. There were whispers of wealth of distant kingdoms where gold and silver flowed freely, where the churches of the south were filled with treasures, unguarded and ripe for the taking. Stories passed from trader to trader, telling of places where the people were rich but weak, where warriors had grown soft, where ships could land without warning and leave before the enemy could react. The Vikings knew hardship. They knew struggle. And they knew opportunity when they saw it. And so, one by one, the first raiding ships slipped away from the shores of Scandinavia, disappearing into the mist, bound for lands unknown. The first raids, a new era begins. It was the summer of the year 793 when history changed forever. On a remote island off the coast of Northumbria, in what is now England, stood a quiet monastery known as Lindisfarne. The monks who lived there had no reason to fear the sea. They had lived in peace for generations, praying, writing, and tending to their simple way of life. But one day, a shadow appeared on the horizon. The waves carried with it something unseen before, something that would shake the world of Christendom to its core. The Vikings had arrived. Long ships sliced through the waves like hunting beasts, their dragon-headed prows striking fear into those who saw them. The monks had no defenses, no walls, no warriors. They were unprepared for what came next. The Vikings stormed the monastery, taking its wealth, burning its halls, and carrying away captives. News of the attack spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves across the Christian world. The age of the Vikings had begun. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the next decades, Viking raiders struck again and again, targeting monasteries, towns, and cities along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. Their longships allowed them to strike with terrifying speed, vanishing before armies could respond. Fear of the Northmen spread, and rulers scrambled to defend their shores. But for the Vikings, these raids were just the start of something much bigger. From raiders to rulers, the evolution of Viking expansion. At first, the Vikings came for gold, silver, and supplies. But as time passed, they began to see something else, a chance to build something greater. Some warriors chose not to return home, instead carving out new settlements in foreign lands. What had started as raids soon turned into conquests. The Vikings were no longer just raiders, they were rulers. In Ireland, they established trading ports that would later become major cities, such as Dublin. In France, they settled along the Seine, founding what would one day be known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In England, Viking warriors took control of entire regions, creating what was called the Danelaw, where Norse law and customs reigned supreme. For some, wealth was no longer measured in gold alone, but in land, in power, in the ability to shape the world itself. The Viking dream had changed. No longer was it enough to raid and return home, many now sought to stay, to build, to create something lasting. But while some settled, others continued to push the limits of the known world. Beyond the seas of Europe, beyond the rivers of the East, lay lands yet to be discovered. Lands that no one in the civilized world had ever set foot upon. Lands that, even today, remain wrapped in mystery. And so, the great Viking explorers were born. Men who sought not war, but wonder. Men who would sail further than any before them, to the edges of the world itself. Their journeys would take them deep into the heart of unknown lands, from the cold rivers of Russia to the distant shores of North America. The sea still called to them, and they would answer. As the sun sets over the northern seas, Viking ships drift along the horizon, their sails full of wind, their prows cutting through the darkening waves. Somewhere in the distance, a distant shore awaits, unseen, untouched, waiting for the first footprints of those who dare to reach it. Ahead, in the next part of our journey, we will sail with the great explorers. We will follow the Norsemen as they travel east into the vast rivers of Russia, where they will shape empires and trade with the distant lands of Byzantium. And then, we will journey west, beyond the known world, to a place that would one day be called Vinland, the first European footsteps in North America. The Vikings were not only warriors and raiders, but travelers, traders, and explorers. While many set sail westward, seeking the distant shores of England, Ireland, and even North America, others turned their sights to the east. There, beyond the forests of Scandinavia, lay vast rivers that stretched into the unknown, deep, winding waters that could carry them far beyond what any Northman had ever seen. This is the story of the Varangians, the Vikings who ventured into the lands of the Rus, who sailed the mighty rivers of Eastern Europe, who built great cities, and who, in time, would become the trusted warriors of the most powerful empire in the world. Byzantium. The call of the East, following the rivers. Unlike the stormy seas of the West, the lands to the east were filled with great rivers, natural highways that carried merchants and adventurers deep into the heart of new lands. The Norse called them Osterviga, the Eastern Way. From the cold shores of the Baltic Sea, Viking longships sailed inland, following the rivers south, moving through thick forests and vast, open plains. These were lands unknown to the people of Scandinavia, but they were not empty. Slavic tribes lived along the riverbanks, farmers and hunters who watched with cautious eyes as the longships passed by. Some would trade with the newcomers, exchanging furs, honey, and amber for fine weapons and silver. Others would resist, raising their spears in defiance. But the Vikings were relentless, and where trade was not welcome, war would follow. Through waterways like the Neva, the Volkhov, and the mighty Dnieper, the Norsemen ventured further and further south. Each river brought them closer to something greater, something legendary. There were whispers of a great city in the south, a place where gold and silver flowed like water, where emperors ruled over vast armies, where treasures beyond imagining lay waiting. This city had many names, but to the Vikings, it was known as Miklagard, the great city. Byzantium. The founding of the Rus, Vikings become kings. Before they could reach Byzantium, the Vikings did something unexpected. They began to settle. Along the rivers, they built fortresses and trading towns, creating new centers of power in a land that was ripe for conquest. These Viking rulers became known as the Rus, a name that would later give rise to the word Russia. One of the most famous Viking leaders of the East was Rurik, a Norse chieftain who, according to legend, was invited by the Slavic tribes to rule over them and bring order to their land. He settled in the town of Novgorod, establishing a dynasty that would rule for centuries. From Novgorod, his successors pushed further south, eventually capturing the city of Kiev, which became the heart of the new Viking Slavic kingdom known as Kievan Rus. Here, the Vikings became more than just warriors and raiders. They became rulers, adopting Slavic customs, building vast trade networks, and forging alliances. They were no longer just Norsemen, they were kings of a new land, their power stretching across the great rivers of the east. But still, the greatest prize lay further south. The dream of reaching Miklagard, Byzantium, burned in their hearts. The Varangian Guard, Viking warriors in the emperor's service. At last, the Norsemen reached their destination. Their longships sailed into the great city of Byzantium, today known as Istanbul, a place unlike anything they had ever seen. Towering walls surrounded the city, so high that no army could hope to breach them. Golden domes glittered in the sunlight, and vast markets overflowed with riches from across the known world. The Vikings had traveled far, but here, in Miklagard, they found something unexpected, a new purpose. The Byzantine emperor, impressed by their strength and fearlessness, offered the Vikings a deal. Those who were willing to serve would be given wealth and status beyond their wildest dreams. And so, the Norsemen became the Varangian Guard, the elite warriors of the Byzantine Empire, the personal bodyguards of the emperor himself. These were no ordinary soldiers. The Varangians were fierce, towering men, wielding massive two-handed axes that could cleave through armor with a single strike. They were loyal only to the emperor, standing beside him in times of war and protecting him from betrayal in times of peace. Their presence became legendary, feared by enemies across the empire. One of the most famous Viking warriors to serve in the Varangian Guard was none other than Harald Hardrada, a man who would later return to the north to claim the throne of Norway and die in battle at Stamford Bridge, marking the end of the Viking Age. But here, in Byzantium, he was just another Norseman seeking fortune, another warrior carving his place into history. The Viking legacy in the East. Over time, the Viking influence in the East faded. The rulers of Kievan Rus converted to Christianity, adopting Slavic traditions and leaving behind their pagan roots. The Varangian Guard continued to serve the Byzantine emperors for centuries, but as the world changed, the need for Viking mercenaries slowly disappeared. Yet, their legacy remained. The cities they founded, like Novgorod and Kiev, became centers of power, shaping the future of Russia and Eastern Europe. The trade routes they established connected Scandinavia to the great empires of the south. And the legends of the Norse warriors who once stood at the gates of Byzantium lived on in stories and sagas, whispered in the halls of kings and emperors. And so, the journey of the Vikings in the east comes to an end. From simple traders to mighty rulers, from wandering warriors to the emperor's chosen guard, they left their mark on the lands of Russia and Byzantium. But the story is not over yet. There is still one final journey to take, one last frontier to explore. The sea stretches endlessly before them, a vast and open expanse of rolling waves and whispering winds. Behind them, the frozen shores of Greenland shrink into the distance. Before them, the unknown. The Vikings have always been explorers, but this journey is different. They are venturing further than any Norseman has ever gone. Beyond the maps, beyond the stories, beyond the edges of the known world. They are searching for a land spoken of in hushed whispers, a place of endless forests and rich, untouched earth. A place they will call Vinland. This is the final great voyage of the Viking Age, a journey to the shores of North America 500 years before Columbus set sail. The Norse in the west, following the edge of the world. Long before the Vikings reached the shores of North America, their thirst for exploration had already carried them westward. Their first stop was the Faroe Islands, a windswept land of towering cliffs and green pastures, where a few settlers made their home among the seabirds and the mist. But the call of the horizon was too strong. The Vikings sailed further, braving the icy waters of the North Atlantic until they reached a place unlike any other, a land of glacier, towering mountains, and deep fjords. They named it Greenland, and though it was anything but green, it became home to a hardy group of Norse settlers led by the legendary Eric the Red. 4 years, the Norse thrived in Greenland, hunting seals, raising livestock, and building settlements along the narrow strips of habitable land. But even here, on the edge of the world, they heard rumors of something greater. A place beyond Greenland, beyond the waves, where the land was fertile and the trees stretched high into the sky. Eric the Red never made the journey himself, but his son, Leif Erikson, would become the first European to set foot in North America. Leif Erikson's journey, the first European in America. The year is around 1000 AD, and Leif Erikson stands at the helm of his longship, guiding it through the frigid waters beyond Greenland. He is not alone. His crew consists of experienced Norse sailors, men who have spent their lives on the sea, their hands hardened by oars, their eyes sharp against the horizon. They first reach a place of jagged, frozen rocks, a land of glacier and icy shores. Leif names it Helgeland, the land of flat stones. It is barren, unwelcoming. They do not stay. They sail further, reaching a land of rolling hills and scattered trees. Markland, the land of forests. It is better, but it is not the paradise they seek. And then, after weeks at sea, they find it a land of soft meadows and rich soil, a place where wild grapes grow in abundance, where the rivers are full of fish and the forests are thick with game. This is the place of legend. This is Vinland. Leif and his men set up camp, building simple houses from timber, exploring the coastline, hunting, fishing, and gathering food. The land is warm compared to Greenland, rich and full of promise. But they are not alone. Encounters with the native peoples, a fateful meeting. As the Vikings settle in Vinland, they begin to notice signs of life. Footprints in the sand. Distant smoke rising from beyond the trees. They are not the first to walk these shores. The land is already home to people the Norse will later call the Skraelings, Native Americans, likely ancestors of the Mi'kmaq or Inuit. At first, there is curiosity. The Norse and the Skraelings observe each other from a distance, unsure, cautious. Trade begins, furs, weapons, and food exchanged in careful silence. But the peace does not last. A misunderstanding, an argument, or perhaps fear, something sparks violence. The Skraelings attack, and the Vikings, despite their weapons and armor, are outnumbered. They fight bravely, but the land is not theirs. It belongs to the people who have lived here for generations. Leif Erikson and his men are forced to abandon their settlement. They return to Greenland, leaving behind only faint traces of their presence. Though other Norse explorers, like Thorfinn Karlsefni, would attempt to return, the Viking foothold in North America never truly takes hold. The land is too vast, the native peoples too strong. The dream of Vinland fades into legend. The legacy of the Norse in America. For centuries, the story of Vinland was thought to be just that, a story. A legend told by Norse skalds, passed down through the sagas. But then, in the 1960s, a discovery changed everything. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, in Canada, archaeologists uncovered something incredible: the remains of a Viking settlement. Elant's Auxiliary Meadows, a site that proved beyond doubt that the Norse had indeed set foot in North America, centuries before Columbus. The ruins of ancient Norse houses, tools, and artifacts lay buried beneath the earth, a forgotten chapter of history waiting to be uncovered. The Vikings may not have stayed, but their journey across the Atlantic changed the way we see history. They were not just warriors and raiders. They were explorers, adventurers, pioneers who dared to cross the edge of the world, seeking something beyond what was known. The Viking Age, roughly spanning from 793 to 1066 AD, was defined by movement. Viking ships appeared on coastlines across Europe, their sails striking fear into unprepared settlements. But raiding was only one piece of the larger Viking expansion. Many Norsemen left their homeland for reasons beyond plunder, including trade, resource scarcity, and the search for new land to settle. The geography of Scandinavia and the need to expand. The Viking homeland, modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, had a harsh climate and limited arable land. Much of Scandinavia was covered in dense forests, fjords, and rocky terrain, making large-scale farming difficult. The growing population placed pressure on resources, and land disputes among powerful families often resulted in conflict. Many Vikings saw opportunities abroad, where they could find fertile farmland, wealth, and a fresh start. Norway, dominated by steep fjords and mountains, had little room for expansion, so Norwegians became seafarers by necessity. Danish Vikings, close to the rich trade routes of the North Sea and the Frankish kingdoms, quickly saw opportunities for raiding and commerce. Swedish Vikings, with easy access to Baltic waterways and Russian river systems, focused their expansion eastward. Raiding as an opportunity. The first recorded Viking raid came in 793 AD, when Norse warriors attacked the Lindisfarne monastery off the coast of Northumbria, England. This marked the beginning of a century of hit-and-run coastal raids across the British Isles and mainland Europe. Monasteries, often filled with gold, silver, and religious artifacts, were easy targets. With little defense and no warning, Viking longships could land, pillage, and escape before local rulers could organize a response. These early raids were small-scale but highly effective, setting the stage for more organized campaigns. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids escalated. Instead of quick attacks, they began overwintering in foreign lands, building fortified bases, and launching full-scale invasions. This shift from raiding to conquest was seen in England, Ireland, and France, where Viking armies established long-term settlements. Trade networks and economic expansion. While raiding was profitable, the Vikings were also traders, integrating into vast networks that connected Scandinavia, Europe, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. Viking merchants exchanged goods such as walrus ivory, furs, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, spices, and glassware. Key trading hubs included Hedeby, Denmark, one of the largest Viking trading towns, connecting the North Sea to the Baltic. Birka, Sweden, a major trade center on Lake Mälaren, dealing in eastern goods. Dublin, Ireland, originally a Viking stronghold, it grew into an important European trade port. York, England, established as the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, it became a commercial hub. Silver was the primary currency in the Viking world, often acquired through trade with the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. Thousands of Arabic dirhams, silver coins, have been found in Viking hoards across Scandinavia, showing the extent of their economic reach. Viking settlements abroad. As Viking expeditions became more frequent, many Norsemen sought permanent settlements rather than constant warfare. They established colonies in England, Danelaw. Large portions of northern and eastern England fell under Viking control. Ireland, cities like Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford began as Viking trade centres. Scotland and the Isles, the Vikings settled the Orkneys, Shetlands, and Hebrides. Normandy, France. In 911 AD, Viking leader Rollo was granted land in northern France, founding the Duchy of Normandy. Beyond Europe, they pushed west to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, and east into Russia, creating the foundation of Kievan Rus. Political and cultural impact. Viking expansion wasn't just about acquiring land and wealth, it also reshaped European politics. The Frankish and English kingdoms were forced to adapt, building stronger defenses and centralizing power. In some cases, Vikings were absorbed into local societies, converting to Christianity and adopting new customs. At home in Scandinavia, the wealth and influence gained from expansion allowed Viking chieftains to grow in power. Some became kings, establishing centralized rule in previously fragmented lands. This transformation laid the groundwork for the emergence of the modern nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Vikings set sail for many reasons: wealth, land, opportunity, and survival. While they are often remembered for their raids, their impact as traders, settlers, and explorers was just as significant. As their reach extended further, they shaped the course of history across Europe and beyond. While many Vikings turned west toward England, Ireland, and the Atlantic, another group ventured into the vast river systems of Eastern Europe. These Norse explorers, known as the Varangians, followed waterways that led them into the lands of the Slavs and Finnic tribes, eventually founding powerful cities and establishing trade links with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. Their legacy would shape the future of Russia and Eastern Europe. The routes to the east. The eastern expansion of the Vikings followed a network of interconnected rivers that linked Scandinavia to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The most significant routes included the Neva River, leading into Lake Ladoga and further south; the Volkhov River, which connected to the major trade center of Novgorod; the Dnieper River, which flowed south through modern-day Ukraine toward the Black Sea and Byzantium; the Volga River, which led to the Caspian Sea and connected the Vikings with Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate. These rivers acted as highways through the vast forests and plains of Eastern Europe. Unlike their raiding campaigns in the West, Viking expeditions here focused heavily on trade and settlement. The rise of the Rus and the founding of Kievan Rus. By the 9th century, Viking merchants and warriors had established settlements along the rivers, interacting with and eventually ruling over the local Slavic and Finnic tribes. The term Rus, from which Russia gets its name, is believed to have originated from the Norse word rods, referring to the wooden oars used to navigate the rivers. According to the Primary Chronicle, a medieval Slavic account, the Slavic tribes invited a Norse leader named Rurik to rule over them around 862 AD, marking the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty. He established Novgorod, which became a major trading hub and political center. His successors expanded further south, capturing the city of Kiev, which became the heart of the new Kievan Rus state. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus had grown into a powerful federation of Slavic and Norse peoples, controlling vast territories and establishing diplomatic and commercial relations with Byzantium and the Islamic world. Trade networks and cultural exchange. The Vikings in the east played a crucial role in linking Scandinavia with the wealth of Byzantium and the caliphates. Trade goods moving along these routes included furs and amber from the forests of the north, slaves captured from Slavic and Baltic tribes, silver coins, dirhams, from the Islamic world, found in large numbers in Viking hordes, silk, spices, and jewelry from Byzantine and Persian merchants. The discovery of thousands of Arabic silver coins in Viking burial sites across Sweden and Russia indicates just how deeply the Norse had integrated into these economic networks. Viking merchants traveled as far as Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, exchanging northern goods for exotic treasures from the Middle East and Central Asia. The Varangian Guard, Viking warriors in Byzantium. While many Vikings in the east were merchants, others became mercenaries and elite warriors in the service of the Byzantine Empire. The Norse referred to Byzantium as Miklagard, meaning the great city, and it was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the world at the time. By the late 10th century, Viking warriors had become highly sought after by the Byzantine emperors. They were recruited into the Varangian Guard, an elite force of Norse and Rus warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. Known for their loyalty, discipline, and fearsome fighting ability, these Viking mercenaries wielded massive two-handed axes, cutting down enemies with devastating force. One of the most famous Varangian guardsmen was Harald Hardrada, who later became the King of Norway and played a pivotal role in the events leading to the end of the Viking Age. Viking settlements in the East. Unlike their settlements in the West, which often replaced local rulers, Viking expansion in the East was more of a cultural integration rather than outright conquest. Over time, the Norse rulers of Kievan Rus intermarried with Slavic nobles, adopted Christianity, and merged into Eastern European society. By 988 AD, Prince Vladimir the Great of Kievan Rus converted to Christianity, aligning his state with Byzantium. The Norse language began to fade, replaced by the Old East Slavic dialects spoken by the local population. Kievan Rus developed into one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe, influencing the future of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The decline of Viking influence in the East. As the 11th century progressed, Viking influence in the East declined due to the Christianization of Scandinavia, which reduced the pagan warrior culture that had fueled Viking expansion. The fall of Kievan Rus into internal struggles and Mongol invasions in the 13th century. The Varangian Guard becoming more Greek and Slavic, as fewer Vikings traveled south. Though the Norse no longer ruled in the East, their impact on Russian and Ukrainian history remained strong. The Rurikid dynasty continued to rule parts of Eastern Europe for centuries, and Russia itself traces its origins back to the Viking state of Kievan Rus. The Vikings in the East were more than just raiders, they were merchants, rulers, and soldiers who helped shape the history of Eastern Europe. They established powerful trade routes, connected the Norse world with Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates, and laid the foundations for the future Russian state. While some Vikings turned eastward to explore the vast rivers of Russia, others ventured further west, navigating the cold, treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. This journey led them to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, making them the first Europeans to reach the New World nearly 500 years before Columbus. Settlement of Iceland, 870 AD. The first major step in the Viking expansion westward was Iceland. While uninhabited by humans before the Vikings arrived, the island was known to Irish monks, who had briefly lived there before abandoning it. However, large-scale settlement only began when Norse sailors from Norway and the British Isles began arriving in the late 9th century. According to the Islandingabok, the Book of the Icelanders, the first Norseman to settle permanently in Iceland was Ingolfur Arnason, who arrived around 874 AD. He built a homestead in Reykjavik, the modern capital of Iceland. Over the next few decades, thousands of Vikings followed, many fleeing the political conflicts and growing power of the kings in Norway. Iceland's landscape was harsh but habitable. The settlers built farms, raised livestock, and adapted to the volcanic environment. By 930 AD, Iceland had established one of the world's first democratic assemblies, known as the Althing, which still functions today as the Icelandic parliament. Though remote, Iceland became an important Viking hub, a stepping stone for further exploration into the even more challenging lands beyond. Eric the Red and the discovery of Greenland, 982 AD. The next great Viking venture westward was the settlement of Greenland, a frozen and hostile land discovered by Eric the Red, one of the most famous explorers of the Viking Age. Born in Norway, Eric moved with his family to Iceland, but was later exiled for committing manslaughter. Instead of returning east, he sailed west in search of a new home, eventually reaching a vast, ice-covered land. He named it Greenland, supposedly to attract settlers by making it sound more inviting than it actually was. In 985 AD, Eric returned to Iceland and recruited people to join him in settling this new land. His expedition brought 25 ships filled with men, women, livestock, and supplies. Only 14 ships survived the harsh journey, but the settlers managed to establish two main colonies on Greenland. The eastern settlement, the larger of the two, located near modern-day Qaqortoq. The western settlement, further north, near Nuuk, the modern capital of Greenland. At its peak, The Viking population in Greenland reached around 5,000 people. They survived by farming, hunting seals, fishing, and trading with Iceland and Norway. Despite its isolation, Greenland remained a Viking territory for over 400 years, until the settlements mysteriously disappeared in the 15th century, likely due to climate change, economic decline, and increasing conflicts with the Inuit. While Erik the Red established Greenland, his son, Leif Erikson, would go even further, leading the Vikings to North America. Leif Erikson and the Viking discovery of North America, 1000 AD. Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, was raised in Greenland but inherited his father's spirit of adventure. Around 1000 AD, inspired by stories of a distant land spotted by another Norse explorer, Jarni Herjolfsson, Leif set out to explore the western horizon. Sailing from Greenland with a crew, Leif became the first European to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings explored 3 distinct regions, each of which Leif named. Helgeland, land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island, a barren, rocky land with little to offer for settlement. Markland, land of forests, probably Labrador, rich in timber, which was valuable in Greenland, where trees were scarce. Vinland, land of wine or land of meadows, believed to be Newfoundland, where the Vikings established a small settlement. The Vinland settlement, known today as Elant's Auxiliary Meadows, contained Viking-style buildings, including longhouses, storage huts, and workshops. Excavations have revealed Norse artifacts, such as iron nails, woodworking tools, and remnants of woven cloth, confirming the presence of Vikings in North America. Unlike Greenland or Iceland, the Vikings did not stay in Vinland permanently. They encountered Native American tribes, whom they called Skraelings. Initially, there was some trade, but tensions soon escalated into violent conflicts. Outnumbered, the Norse chose to abandon Vinland and return to Greenland after just a few years. Although Leif Erikson's expedition failed to establish a lasting colony, it remains one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age, the first European encounter with the Americas. The end of the Western settlements. Despite the initial success of Iceland and Greenland, Viking expansion in the west eventually declined. Iceland remained a Viking stronghold, but political shifts in Norway and Europe drew its settlers into broader Scandinavian politics. Greenland's population shrank due to the Little Ice Age, making farming unsustainable. By the 1400s, the Norse settlements had vanished. The Americas remained out of reach. The Norse lacked the numbers to establish a lasting presence, and the powerful indigenous populations made long-term settlement impractical. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age was coming to an end. The same adventurous spirit that led the Norse across the seas was gradually replaced by political centralization, Christian influence, and economic shifts in Europe. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were pioneers. Their voyages across the North Atlantic connected Scandinavia to new lands, from Iceland to Greenland to North America. They were the first Europeans to explore the Americas, centuries before anyone else. Even though their settlements in Greenland and Vinland did not last, their impact on history remains undeniable. The sagas of these explorers were passed down for generations, and their legacy was confirmed through archaeological discoveries like Elant's Auxiliary Meadows. With the Western expansion complete, the Viking Age was entering its final phase. In the next section, we will turn to one of the most crucial aspects of Viking life, their ships, seafaring skills, and the technology that made their voyages possible. The success of the Viking Age was built on one thing: their ships. Without them, there would have been no raids, no explorations, no long-distance trade. Viking ships were fast, flexible, and ahead of their time, giving Norse seafarers a massive advantage over their enemies and rivals. These vessels allowed them to navigate both open oceans and shallow rivers, something no other medieval European ships could do as effectively. The different types of Viking ships. The Vikings designed ships for different purposes, but all followed the same general principles. They were long, narrow, and built for speed and maneuverability. The two main types were 1. Longships, Draka and Snekja, the Viking warships. Longships were the iconic Viking vessels, used for raids, warfare, and exploration. These ships were designed for speed, agility, and rapid beach landings, allowing Vikings to strike with surprise and retreat quickly. Draka, dragon ships, the most famous longships, often used by chieftains and kings. These were large and elaborately decorated, with carved dragon heads on the prow to intimidate enemies. Snekja, serpent ships, are slightly smaller and more common type of longship, used in both raids and military campaigns. Key features: long and slender, typically 20 to 35 meters in length. Shallow draft, could sail in just 1 meter of water. Could be rowed or sailed, depending on wind conditions. Symmetrical design, meaning it could reverse direction easily without turning around. Crew capacity, usually carried between 20 and 100 warriors, depending on the size. These ships made the Vikings unstoppable in coastal raids. They could land on beaches, riverbanks, or even directly into battle, unloading warriors in a matter of minutes before disappearing just as quickly. 2. Nor, the Viking cargo ship. While longships were built for war, the Nor was built for trade and long-distance travel. This was the merchant ship of the Viking world, used to transport goods, livestock, and settlers across the sea. Key features: shorter and wider than longships, with a deeper hull. Designed for carrying heavy cargo like timber, furs, wool, silver, and food supplies. Single large sail, rather than relying on oars. Could handle rough ocean travel better than longships. The Nor was the ship that carried settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, and it was also the backbone of Viking trade routes across Europe, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. Shipbuilding materials and techniques. Viking shipwrights were highly skilled craftsmen, and their shipbuilding techniques were centuries ahead of their time. They used a method called clinker-built construction, where overlapping planks were fastened together with iron rivets and wooden pegs. Wood selection. Viking ships were typically built from oak, which was strong yet flexible. Pine and ash were also used for different parts of the ship. Steam bending. The planks were softened with steam before being bent into shape, allowing for the smooth curves that made Viking ships so hydrodynamic. Waterproofing. The planks were sealed with tar, animal hair, and moss, keeping the ship watertight. Keel design. The keel, the central beam of the ship, provided stability, making the ship able to handle both deep ocean waves and narrow river passages. The combination of lightweight materials, flexible planks, and hydrodynamic design allowed Viking ships to reach speeds of 10 to 15 knots, 18 to 28 kilometers per hour, incredibly fast for medieval times. Sails, oars, and navigation. Viking ships used a combination of sails and oars, making them highly adaptable. Sails, made from wool, reinforced with leather strips for durability. A large rectangular sail powered by the wind allowed Vikings to cover vast distances with minimal rowing. Oars, used when there was no wind, or for precise maneuvering, especially when approaching a coastline. Steering. Unlike later European ships that had a central rudder, Viking ships used a steering or starboard side rudder, which gave better control in both deep water and shallow rivers. With this advanced ship technology, the Vikings could cross the North Sea in just a few days, reach Iceland in a week, and navigate all the way to the Middle East through Russian rivers. Viking ships were a masterpiece of engineering, lightweight, flexible, fast, and capable of sailing in almost any condition. These ships made Viking raids possible, opened up vast trade networks, and allowed Norse explorers to reach North America centuries before Columbus. Viking ships were technological marvels, but they were only as effective as the sailors who commanded them. Unlike later European explorers who used compasses and detailed maps, the Vikings relied on observation, experience, and natural indicators to navigate the seas. Their ability to cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean with precision was one of the greatest achievements of the Viking Age. Viking navigation, finding the way without a compass. The Vikings navigated using a combination of astronomical observations, natural landmarks, and experimental tools that allowed them to travel vast distances. 1. Sun navigation. One of the primary tools Vikings used for navigation was the sun, which provided a fixed reference point throughout the day. At midday, when the sun was at its highest point, sailors could determine their latitude by observing its angle. On cloudy days, Vikings may have used sunstones, solar crystals, a form of calcite or cordierite that could detect polarized light. By rotating the stone, They could identify the sun's position even when it was hidden behind clouds. Experiments have shown that sunstones can provide fairly accurate navigation, supporting the theory that Vikings used them. 2. The stars and the North Star, Polaris. At night, the Vikings relied on the stars, particularly Polaris, the North Star, which remains almost fixed in the sky. By keeping Polaris at a specific height on the horizon, sailors could maintain their course. This technique allowed the Vikings to travel along consistent latitudes, meaning they could reach Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland by following the same east-west path across the Atlantic. 3. Coastal navigation and landmarks. When traveling along coasts and rivers, Vikings relied on known landmarks, mountains, and islands to determine their location. They developed detailed mental maps, remembering how many days of sailing it took to reach a certain point. Some Norse sagas even mention the use of sailing markers, where Vikings stacked stones along shorelines to create artificial navigation points. 4. Bird and whale navigation. In the open ocean, where landmarks were absent, Vikings used wildlife as natural guides. Birds, when they saw seabirds, they knew they were close to land. Some Vikings even released ravens from their ships. If the bird flew in a straight line, it was heading toward land. If it circled, the ship was still far from shore. Whales and fish. Certain whale species and fish prefer specific water temperatures and ocean currents, so their presence helped Vikings estimate how far they were from northern or southern waters. By combining these techniques, Vikings could navigate hundreds of kilometers without modern instruments, making them one of the most advanced seafaring cultures of their time. How Vikings survived long voyages. Life at sea was difficult, and Viking sailors had to be well prepared to survive journeys that could last weeks or even months. 1. Food and supplies on long voyages. Viking ships had no refrigeration, so food had to be non-perishable and easy to store. Dried and salted fish, especially cod, was the main food source. Smoked and dried meats, such as lamb, beef, and horse, were common. Flatbreads and grains were carried in sealed barrels to prevent spoilage. Fermented dairy products, like skyr, a type of yogurt, provided additional nutrition. Mead, ale, and water were stored in barrels, though freshwater supplies had to be carefully rationed. Since fishing was a key skill, Vikings often caught fresh fish along their route to supplement their supplies. 2. Sleeping and living conditions on ships. Unlike later European sailing vessels, Viking ships did not have cabins. The crew slept on deck, using animal skins and wool blankets to stay warm. In stormy weather, they covered themselves with tar-coated cloth to stay dry. There were no toilets, waste was simply dumped overboard. Fires could not be lit on wooden ships, so food was either eaten cold or pre-cooked before departure. Despite the hardships, Viking sailors were highly skilled at maintaining their ships, making repairs at sea, and adapting to harsh conditions. 3. The importance of teamwork and leadership. A Viking ship was only as strong as its crew. Every voyage required expert coordination, as rowing, steering, and managing sails all had to be done efficiently. The steersman, styromartha, was responsible for navigation. The ship's owner, skipari, was usually the commander and had final authority. Warriors and traders alike were expected to work together, whether rowing or handling sails. Viking teamwork and discipline were key to their success, allowing them to sail in tight formations, launch coordinated beach landings, and travel great distances with minimal resources. Famous Viking voyages. The Viking Age was marked by legendary voyages that expanded their influence across Europe and beyond. 1. The journey to Iceland and Greenland. As discussed in previous sections, Vikings discovered and settled Iceland in the late 9th century, followed by Greenland in the 10th century under Eric the Red. These journeys required weeks of sailing across open ocean, relying entirely on navigation skills and endurance. 2. The first European voyage to North America. The most famous Viking voyage was Leif Erikson's journey to Vinland, Newfoundland, Canada, around 1000 AD. This expedition proved that Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the Americas long before Columbus. 3. The Varangian expeditions to Byzantium. In the east, Vikings sailed through Russian rivers to reach Byzantium, where they traded and served as elite bodyguards in the Varangian Guard. This journey often took months of river travel, passing through hostile Slavic and Turkic territories, requiring careful diplomacy and superior navigation skills. The end of Viking seafaring dominance. By the 12th century, Viking seafaring had begun to decline due to several factors. The rise of Christianity in Scandinavia led to fewer Norse expeditions and raids. European naval technology improved, making other fleets more competitive. Scandinavian kingdoms became more centralized, focusing on local politics rather than overseas expansion. Despite this, Viking maritime traditions influenced later European ship designs, and many of their exploration routes remained in use for centuries. The Vikings were some of the greatest sailors in history, mastering navigation, shipbuilding, and survival at sea without modern tools. Their voyages connected Scandinavia to Europe, the Middle East, and even North America, shaping the medieval world in ways still felt today. The Vikings had a rich and complex belief system, shaped by centuries of oral tradition, mythology, and spiritual practices. Unlike monotheistic religions, Norse mythology described a vast and interconnected universe, where gods, giants, humans, and mystical beings all played a role in the fate of existence. At the heart of this belief system was Yggdrasil, the world tree, which connected the 9 realms, each home to different beings and forces that shaped Viking cosmology. The 9 realms of Norse mythology. According to Viking beliefs, the universe was not a single world, but 9 interconnected realms, all supported by Yggdrasil, the cosmic tree that held everything together. These realms represented different forces of existence, from the homes of gods and giants to the world of humans and the realm of the dead. 1. Midgard, the world of humans. Midgard, or Middle Earth, was the human world, where Vikings and all people lived. It was surrounded by a great ocean filled with Jormungandr, the massive serpent that encircled the world. The gods built a magical bridge, Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, to connect Midgard to their realm. 2. Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods. Asgard was the home of the Aesir gods, the most powerful gods in Norse mythology, including Odin, Thor, and Frigg. It was a place of great halls, including Valhalla, where fallen warriors were taken after death to prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. 3. Vanaheim, the land of the Vani gods. Vanaheim was the home of the Vani gods, who were associated with fertility, nature, and magic. Unlike the Aesir, the Vani were seen as more peaceful and tied to the earth. The 2 groups of gods once fought a great war, but eventually made peace, and some Vani gods, like Frey and Freyja, lived among the Aesir. 4. Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Jotunheim was the realm of the Jotnar, giants, powerful beings often in conflict with the gods. Unlike Midgard and Asgard, it was a chaotic land, filled with mountains, wild forests, and powerful magic. Many Viking myths involved gods traveling to Jotunheim to challenge or outwit the giants. 5. Alfheim, the home of the Light Elves. Alfheim was the land of the Light Elves, Ljósalfar, mystical beings associated with beauty, wisdom, and magic. They were seen as lesser divine beings, somewhat similar to angels in later European mythology. 6. Svartalfheim, or Nidavellir, the land of the dwarfs. This realm was home to the dwarfs, master craftsmen who forged some of the greatest weapons and treasures in Norse mythology, including Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and Odin's spear, Gungnir. The dwarfs lived underground, working in forges deep beneath the earth. 7. Helheim, the realm of the dead. Helheim was the Viking underworld, ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki. Unlike Valhalla, which was reserved for warriors, Helheim was where those who died of old age or illness would go. It was not a place of punishment, but a cold and shadowy realm, where the dead existed in a neutral, dreamlike state. 8. Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Muspelheim was a land of fire and lava, home to fire giants and demons, including Surtur, the giant who would bring about the end of the world during Ragnarok. It was believed to be one of the first realms created, existing before even the gods themselves. 9. Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist. Niflheim was a frozen wasteland of ice, mist, and eternal darkness. According to Norse creation myths, the first living being, Ymir, was born here when the warmth of Muspelheim met the cold of Niflheim. This realm was also home to the well of Hvergelmir, the source of all rivers in the Viking world. Yggdrasil, the world tree and the axis of existence. At the center of the 9 realms stood Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that held the universe together. Its roots stretched into the underworld, linking the world of the dead with the living. Its branches reached into the heavens, touching Asgard and beyond. Its trunk connected all of existence, serving as a bridge between the different worlds. Yggdrasil was also home to various mythical creatures. Nidhogg, a great serpent, gnawed at its roots, seeking to destroy it. Eagle and hawk, wise birds, sat at the top, watching over the world. Ratatoska, the mischievous squirrel, ran up and down the tree, carrying insults between the eagle and Nidhogg. In Viking belief, as long as Yggdrasil stood, the universe remained in balance, but one day, it would tremble and fall during Ragnarok, the end of the world. Fate, the Norns, and the unchangeable future. Unlike many later religions, the Vikings did not believe in free will in the way modern societies do. Instead, they believed in fate, WRD, the idea that every person's life was woven into a grand, unchangeable pattern. At the base of Yggdrasil sat 3 mysterious beings, the Norns, who controlled fate by weaving the threads of destiny. Urd, the past. Verdandi, the present. Skuld, the future. Even the gods could not escape fate. Odin himself was doomed to die at Ragnarok, despite all his wisdom and efforts to prevent it. This belief in an inescapable destiny shaped much of Viking thinking. A warrior did not fear death, because his fate was already written. It was how he met his end that truly mattered. Viking mythology was not just a collection of stories, it was a framework for understanding the world. The Norse saw their universe as interconnected, dynamic, and full of cosmic forces battling for balance. Yggdrasil was the backbone of existence. The 9 realms explained the different forces at play in nature and the afterlife. Fate and the Norns determined the course of all things, from the lives of men to the deaths of gods. The Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each representing different aspects of life, nature, and the cosmos. The gods were divided into 2 main groups, the Aesir and the Vani. The Aesir were the dominant gods, associated with war, wisdom, and power, while the Vani were linked to fertility, nature, and magic. Unlike gods in later monotheistic religions, Norse gods were not all-powerful or immortal. They could be wounded, deceived, and even killed, and many were fated to die in the final battle of Ragnarok. The Aesir, the gods of power, war, and fate. The Aesir were the dominant gods of Asgard, associated with strength, leadership, war, and the cosmic order. The most important figures in this group were Odin, Thor, and Loki, but many others played crucial roles in Norse mythology. 1. Odin, the All-Father and God of Wisdom. Odin was the chief of the gods, ruling from his great hall, Valhalla. He was a god of war, wisdom, magic, and poetry, always seeking knowledge and power at any cost. He sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom, gaining unparalleled knowledge. He hanged himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes, the Viking alphabet, believed to hold magical properties. He had 2 ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, who flew across the world and reported back to him. He rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, the fastest creature in existence. As the god of warriors, he chose which fallen fighters would be taken to Valhalla, where they would train for Ragnarok. Despite being the ruler of the gods, Odin was not a god of fairness or mercy. He was often manipulative, cunning, and ruthless, always looking for ways to ensure his survival in the coming battle of Ragnarok. 2. Thor, the protector of Midgard. Thor was the most famous and widely worshipped of all the Norse gods. He was the god of thunder, storms, and strength, and the primary protector of both gods and humans. He wielded Njolnir, a hammer capable of summoning lightning and crushing mountains. He wore a magical belt, Megingja, that doubled his strength. He was the son of Odin but far more popular among common people due to his honesty and straightforward nature. He fought giants, Jotnar, constantly to keep Midgard safe. Unlike Odin, who was strategic and manipulative, Thor was a warrior god who relied on brute strength and courage to defeat his enemies. He was also known for his short temper but strong sense of justice. 3. Loki, the trickster and chaos bringer. Loki was one of the most complex and unpredictable gods in Norse mythology. He was neither fully Aesir nor Jotun, belonging to both worlds but loyal to neither. He was the god of mischief, deception, and transformation, capable of changing his shape at will. He was responsible for both helping and harming the gods, depending on his mood. He was the father of many monstrous beings, including Jormungandr, the world serpent; Fenrir, the giant wolf destined to kill Odin; Hel, the ruler of the underworld. Loki's actions ultimately led to Ragnarok, the end of the world, when he would betray the gods and fight against them in the final battle. 4. Tyr, the god of war and justice. Tyr was the god of law, honor, and war, often associated with bravery and sacrifice. He was the one-handed god, having lost his right hand to Fenrir when the gods tricked the wolf into being bound. Unlike Odin and Thor, who were gods of battle strategy and brute force, Tyr was the god of warriors' honor and upholding fair combat and justice. Though not as famous as Thor or Odin, Tyr was one of the oldest gods in Norse mythology, and many Viking warriors saw him as the ideal model of courage. 5. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods. Heimdall was the guardian of Asgard, stationed at the end of Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. He had perfect eyesight and hearing, able to see across great distances and hear even the grass growing. He carried the Galahar horn, a horn that he would blow to signal the beginning of Ragnarok. He and Loki were destined to kill each other in the final battle. Heimdall represented eternal vigilance, making sure that no enemy, especially the giants, could invade Asgard without warning. The Vani, the gods of nature, fertility, and magic. The Vani were an older group of gods, mostly associated with nature, fertility, and prosperity. Unlike the Aesir, they were more peaceful, focused on growth rather than war. The Aesir and Vani once fought a great war, but later made peace, exchanging hostages to unite their forces. 1. Frey, the god of fertility and peace. Frey was one of the most beloved Norse gods, associated with prosperity, peace, and bountiful harvests. He ruled over Alfheim, the land of the elves. He owned a magical ship, Skidbladnir, that could fold up like cloth. He rode Gullinbursti, a golden boar that shined with divine light. He symbolized abundance and the blessings of nature. Frey was not a warrior god like Thor or Odin. Instead, he represented peace, love, and wealth, which made him especially important in agriculture-based Viking communities. 2. Freyja, the goddess of love and war. Freyja was one of the most powerful Norse goddesses, embodying love, beauty, magic, and warfare. She was half warrior, half sorceress, leading half of the fallen warriors to her own afterlife hall, Folkvanga, while the other half went to Valhalla. She possessed a cloak of falcon feathers, allowing her to fly. She was associated with seer, Norse magic and prophecy. She rode in a chariot pulled by 2 cats, a symbol of independence and mystery. Freyja was both a lover and a warrior, representing the duality of life, passion and destruction, beauty and death. 3. Njord, the god of the sea and wealth. Njord was the god of the sea, fishing, and wealth, especially important to Viking sailors. He controlled winds, waves, and good fortune in trade. He was the father of Frey and Freyja. He was often invoked for safe voyages and bountiful catches. Njord was one of the few gods who survived Ragnarok, symbolizing the continuation of nature and prosperity after the destruction of the world. The Viking gods were not perfect beings, they were flawed, ambitious, and bound by fate, much like the humans who worshipped them. Odin sought wisdom at any cost. Thor defended the world with brute strength. Loki embodied chaos and deception. The Vani represented nature's cycle of life, growth, and renewal. The Vikings had a deep and complex view of death and the afterlife, believing that what happened after death depended on how a person lived. Warriors sought a glorious end in battle, hoping to join Odin in Valhalla, while others found themselves in Helheim or other afterlife realms. Beyond death, the Norse believed that the world itself was doomed to destruction, with all existence culminating in Ragnarok, the final battle that would reshape the universe. Viking burial customs and rituals. Death was not seen as an end but a transition to another realm. How a person was buried depended on their social status, achievements, and beliefs. The Vikings performed different types of burials, each with its own significance. 1. Ship burials, the journey to the afterlife. For the most important individuals, chiefs, warriors, and wealthy leaders, the body was sometimes placed in a burial ship, either set afloat or buried beneath the earth. Ships were believed to carry the dead to the afterlife, just as they carried the living across the sea. Burials included weapons, jewelry, food, and even sacrificed animals or servants, ensuring the deceased had everything they needed in the next world. Some of the most famous Viking ship burials include the Osberg and Gokstad ships, found in Norway, which contained well-preserved remains of high-status individuals. 2. Cremation, fire and transformation. Many Vikings were cremated, believing that fire released the soul to the afterlife. The body was placed on a funeral pyre, often with weapons, valuables, and personal items. In some cases, ships were set ablaze and sent out to sea, a tradition romanticized in later Norse legends. Archaeological evidence suggests that some cremated remains were placed in burial mounds, marking the site as sacred ground. 3. Grave goods, preparing for the afterlife. The Vikings believed that the dead would need possessions in the afterlife. Common grave goods included weapons and armor for warriors, jewelry, combs, and fine clothing for noblemen and women, tools, drinking horns, and even board games. Horses, dogs, and livestock were sometimes sacrificed to accompany the deceased. The richer or more powerful the person, the grander the burial, symbolizing their importance in life and beyond. The afterlife, where did the dead go? Unlike many religious traditions that had a single afterlife, the Vikings believed in multiple destinations after death, depending on how one lived and died. 1. Valhalla, the Hall of Fallen Warriors. One of the most well-known Viking afterlife beliefs was Valhalla, the Great Hall of Odin, where warriors who died bravely in battle were taken. Only those chosen by Odin or the Valkyries could enter. Warriors, Einherjar, spent eternity feasting, drinking, and training, preparing for Ragnarok. Each day, the warriors fought to the death, and by nightfall, their wounds healed so they could feast again. Despite its reputation, Valhalla was not heaven, it was a warrior's paradise, but also a place of preparation for the final battle. 2. Folkvanga, Freyja's afterlife realm. Not all warriors went to Valhalla. Half of those who died in battle were said to be taken to Freyja's realm, Folkvanga. Less is known about Folkvanga, but it was seen as a peaceful, noble realm compared to Valhalla's endless battles. Freyja had the first choice of fallen warriors, meaning some of the greatest Viking heroes ended up in her hall instead of Odin's. 3. Helheim, the realm of the dead. For those who did not die in battle, their afterlife was in Helheim, the underworld ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki. Unlike Christian hell, Helheim was not a place of punishment, it was simply the realm of the dead. It was described as cold, misty, and shadowy, a land of eternal stillness. Those who died of illness, old age, or accidents ended up here. Despite being neutral, Helheim had darker associations, especially for cowards or oathbreakers, who were believed to suffer a worse fate in its deeper levels. 4. The restless dead, Draugr and undead beings. Vikings also believed that some spirits could return from the grave as Draugr, ghostly or undead figures that haunted the living. Draugr were said to guard treasure, seek revenge, or bring bad luck. Special burial rituals, like tying the dead's toes together or placing iron spikes in graves, were meant to prevent the dead from rising. The fear of the restless dead led to many superstitions and burial practices, showing how deeply Vikings respected and feared the afterlife. Ragnarok, the end of the Viking world. Viking mythology taught that even the gods were not eternal. The world was fated to end in destruction and rebirth, an event known as Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The signs of Ragnarok. Before the final battle, certain events would signal the end of the world. The death of Balder, the most beloved god, would mark the beginning of chaos. Fimbulwinter, an endless winter lasting 3 years, would cover the world in ice. The sun and moon would be devoured by wolves, plunging the world into darkness. Massive earthquakes would break the bonds of Loki and Fenrir, setting them free. The final battle. During Ragnarok, the forces of order and chaos would clash in a massive battle between the gods and their enemies. Odin would fight Fenrir but would be devoured by the giant wolf. Thor would battle Jormungandr, the world serpent, killing it but dying from its venom. Loki and Heimdall would kill each other in their final fight. Surtur, the fire giant, would engulf the world in flames, destroying everything. The aftermath, the rebirth of the world. Although Ragnarok meant the end of the current world, it was not the end of all existence. After the destruction, a new world would rise from the sea. 2 human survivors, Lif and Lifthrasir, would repopulate the earth. Some gods, like Balder and Thor's sons, would return to rebuild Asgard. Ragnarok was both a warning and a promise, a story of destruction, but also renewal, showing the Vikings' acceptance of fate and the cycles of life. Viking mythology saw death as just another step in a larger cycle, with the afterlife reflecting how one lived. Glorious warriors feasted in Valhalla, while others found peace in Helheim or Folkvanga. But even the gods themselves were not immune to fate, as Ragnarok foretold the end of their world and the beginning of a new one. This belief in cycles, fate, and inevitable rebirth shaped how the Vikings lived, fearless in battle, accepting of hardship, and always prepared for whatever came next. Battle tactics, and how they dominated the battlefield for centuries. The Vikings were skilled warriors, feared across Europe for their brutal efficiency, disciplined combat, and relentless raids. Unlike many medieval armies, Viking warriors were not professional soldiers. Most were farmers, traders, or craftsmen who took up arms when needed. However, their weaponry, training, and tactics made them some of the most effective fighters of the early medieval period. The most common Viking weapons. Viking warriors used a wide variety of weapons, from simple farming tools repurposed for battle to finely crafted swords and axes made by master blacksmiths. 1. Swords, the most valued weapon. A sword was the most prestigious weapon a Viking could own. Unlike axes or spears, which were common and practical, swords were expensive and reserved for elite warriors, chieftains, and kings. Viking swords were typically double-edged, about 70 to 90 centimeters long, and made from high-quality iron or steel. Most Viking swords were pattern-welded, meaning layers of iron were twisted and forged together to create a stronger, more flexible blade. The hilt, handle, was often decorated with silver, bronze, or even gold, showing the status of its owner. Some swords had names, such as the legendary Ulfbert swords, which were far superior to most European weapons of the time. Despite their effectiveness, swords were not the primary weapon of most Vikings. They were expensive to make, and only the wealthiest warriors could afford them. 2. Axes, the Vikings' favorite weapon. The axe was the most common weapon among Viking warriors, as it was cheap, easy to make, and highly effective in battle. Many Vikings already owned axes for chopping wood, so using them in combat was a natural transition. Bearded axes had an extended lower blade for hooking shields, weapons, or enemy limbs. Dane axes were massive two-handed axes used by elite warriors. With long shafts and wide cutting blades, they could split helmets and shields with a single blow. Throwing axes were sometimes used in battle, but most were meant for close combat. The axe became a symbol of Viking warfare, and even today, it is often associated with Norse warriors. 3. Spears, the most practical weapon. Although axes and swords are more famous, the spear was the main weapon of most Viking warriors. Spears were cheaper to make than swords and had a long reach, making them effective for both thrusting and throwing. Some spears had broad leaf-shaped heads, designed for stabbing through armor, while others were lighter and thrown like javelins. Viking shield walls relied heavily on spear formations, allowing warriors to fight at a distance before engaging in close combat. Even Odin, the chief Norse god, was associated with the spear, carrying Gungnir, a legendary spear that never missed its target. 4. Bows and arrows, the overlooked Viking weapon. While Vikings are often portrayed as close combat warriors, they also used bows and arrows effectively, especially in sieges and naval battles. Viking bows were made of yew, ash, or elm, with a draw weight of up to 100 pounds, capable of piercing armor. Arrows were tipped with iron heads, often designed to break shields and penetrate mail armor. Archers played a key role in softening enemy lines before melee combat began. Bows were also used for hunting, making them a valuable skill outside of war. 5. Shields, the Viking's lifeline in combat. A Viking's shield was just as important as his weapon, often saving his life in battle. Most Viking shields were round, made of wood, and covered in leather or linen to reinforce them. A central iron boss protected the warrior's hand and was used to punch or push enemies. Some shields were painted with symbols or runes, representing protection or the warrior's clan. Vikings were highly skilled at using shields, and their famous shield wall tactic was key to their battlefield success. 6. Armor and helmets, the Viking warrior's protection. Most Viking warriors did not wear heavy armor, as chainmail was expensive and only available to wealthy fighters. However, they still had ways to protect themselves. Chainmail hauberks, long shirts of interwoven metal rings, were worn by chieftains and elite warriors. Padded leather and wool tunics provided some protection for common warriors. Iron helmets were simple, rounded, and did not have horns. The idea of horned helmets comes from later medieval myths. Since most Vikings relied on speed and mobility, their armor was lighter than that of knights, allowing them to fight effectively in both land battles and ship raids. Viking warriors carried a variety of weapons, but their choice depended on status, wealth, and fighting style. Swords were the weapons of the elite. Axes were the most common and deadly tools. Spears dominated formations and shield walls. Bows and arrows were used for ranged attacks. Shields were a Viking's best defense. These weapons, combined with superior tactics and a warrior's mindset, made the Vikings some of the most feared fighters of their time. The Vikings were not just fierce warriors, they were also highly skilled tacticians who used superior strategy, speed, and teamwork to win battles. Their fighting style was adaptable, disciplined, and unpredictable, allowing them to defeat much larger, better-equipped armies. Whether attacking in open-field battles, storming castles, or launching swift raids, the Vikings used tactics that kept their enemies off balance and terrified. 1. The shield wall, the foundation of Viking combat. One of the most effective Viking battle formations was the shield wall, skjoldborg, a tightly packed line of warriors locking their shields together to form a solid defensive barrier. Warriors in the front line held their shields edge to edge, creating a nearly impenetrable wall. Fighters behind the first line could thrust spears through gaps or throw axes and javelins over the top. If an enemy rushed the shield wall, the Vikings could use their shields to bash, push, and break enemy lines. The shield wall required discipline and teamwork, and battles often became a test of endurance. Whoever's wall broke first would lose the fight. This formation was also used by Anglo-Saxon and Frankish armies, but the Vikings were especially skilled at breaking enemy walls by targeting weak points. Breaking the enemy's shield wall. To defeat enemy shield walls, Vikings used specific strategies. Feigned retreats, pretending to flee to lure enemies out of formation, then turning to counterattack. Throwing spears and axes, forcing the enemy to raise their shields, creating gaps for attack. Using Dane axes, these massive two-handed axes could reach over enemy shields, striking helmets and shoulders. Pushing tactics, Vikings could suddenly charge forward as a unit, breaking enemy cohesion. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, is a famous example where Viking warriors held a bridge against a superior force, using their discipline and shield wall tactics to hold back the Anglo-Saxons for hours. 2. Hit-and-run tactics, speed over strength. Viking warriors did not fight like medieval knights in long, drawn-out sieges. They preferred quick, decisive battles, using hit-and-run tactics to surprise and overwhelm their enemies. How Vikings used speed to win battles. Rapid coastal raids, Viking longships allowed them to land, attack, and retreat before reinforcements arrived. Striking at weak points, instead of attacking enemy armies head-on, Vikings targeted villages, monasteries, and supply lines. Fighting in waves, instead of a single charge, Viking warriors often attacked in multiple waves, exhausting their enemies. Their ability to retreat and regroup quickly made them difficult to defeat, as they never relied on traditional siege warfare or prolonged engagements. 3. Berserkers, the Viking shock troops. Among the Viking warriors, some fought with a terrifying, almost supernatural fury. These were the berserkers. Who were the berserkers? Berserkers were elite Viking warriors who fought in a frenzied state, known as berserkganga. They were said to feel no pain, shrugging off wounds that would kill normal men. Some historical sources suggest that berserkers used hallucinogenic mushrooms or herbs to reach a trance-like state. They often fought without armor, believing they were protected by Odin's magic. Berserkers were used as shock troops, leading the charge to break enemy formations. Their wild, unpredictable fighting style spread fear among their enemies, making them psychologically as well as physically devastating. The word berserk, meaning recklessly violent, comes from these legendary warriors. 4. Naval warfare, dominating the seas. The Vikings were not just land-based warriors, they were masters of naval combat. Their longships gave them a massive advantage over traditional European fleets, allowing them to strike fast and escape easily. How the Vikings used ships in combat. Surprise attacks. Viking longships could land directly on beaches and riverbanks, avoiding heavily fortified ports. River raids. Vikings sailed deep into enemy territory, attacking towns far inland by using rivers. Boarding tactics. In ship battles, Vikings threw grappling hooks to pull enemy ships close, then boarded them for melee combat. Shallow water maneuvering. Longships could navigate in just 1 meter of water, allowing them to escape where heavier enemy ships could not follow. One of the most famous Viking naval battles was the Battle of Hafrsfjord, 872 AD, where King Harald Fairhair used superior fleet tactics to unite Norway under his rule. 5. Psychological warfare, using fear as a weapon. The Vikings were masters of intimidation, and they often won battles before they even began by spreading fear and chaos among their enemies. How the Vikings used fear to their advantage. Brutal reputation. Stories of Viking cruelty spread across Europe, making defenders more likely to surrender. Terror tactics. They burned villages, destroyed churches, and took captives, creating a sense of helplessness. Battle cries and war drums. Loud chanting and horn blasts created panic in enemy ranks. Berserkers and painted warriors. Some Viking warriors painted their bodies, wore wolf skins, or fought naked, making them look like demons. Many European rulers, especially in England and France, paid the Danegeld, tribute money, just to avoid Viking attacks, proof that fear alone could be as powerful as an army. Vikings were not just raiders, they were highly skilled warriors who used intelligence, speed, and strategy to dominate the battlefield. The shield wall gave them a strong defensive position. Hit-and-run tactics allowed them to win with speed and surprise. Berserkers acted as shock troops, breaking enemy lines. Naval warfare gave them complete control over rivers and coasts. Psychological warfare helped them win battles without fighting. Their combination of discipline, strategy, and fearless aggression made the Vikings one of the most effective fighting forces in early medieval history. While the Vikings are often remembered for their raids, they were also conquerors and rulers who established long-lasting settlements across Europe. Their military campaigns were not just about plunder, they shaped entire nations, created new kingdoms, and influenced European politics for centuries. This section explores the major Viking conquests, how they ruled over occupied lands, and the lasting impact of their military campaigns. 1. The Viking conquest of England, the Danelaw, 865 to 954 AD. England was one of the Vikings' most important targets, and over several generations, they transformed from raiders into rulers. The Great Heathen Army, 865 AD. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force, later called the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. Led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubbe Ragnarsson, this army was far larger than previous Viking raids. They were coming to conquer, not just plunder. Over the next decade, they systematically captured major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, including Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. By 878 AD, nearly half of England was under Viking control. The Danelaw, Viking rule in England. The conquered regions became known as the Danelaw, where Viking laws and customs took root. The Vikings established York, Jorvik, as their capital, turning it into a major trading centre. Viking settlements grew, with Norse warriors intermarrying with locals and influencing Anglo-Saxon culture. The fight for England, Alfred the Great versus the Vikings. The last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex, led by Alfred the Great, successfully resisted Viking expansion. After the Battle of Edington, 878 AD, The Vikings were forced to accept a peace treaty, but they remained in control of northern and eastern England. Over the next century, Anglo-Saxon kings gradually reclaimed territory from Viking rule, and in 954 AD, the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed. Despite the Viking withdrawal, Norse influence remained strong in England, shaping its language, law, and culture. 2. The Viking settlement of Ireland and Scotland. The Vikings had a massive impact on both Ireland and Scotland, creating permanent Norse settlements that lasted for centuries. The founding of Dublin, 841 AD. Viking raids in Ireland began in the 8th century, but by 841 AD, they established a permanent settlement at Dublin. Dublin became a major Viking trading hub, dealing in slaves, silver, and exotic goods. Over time, Viking Irish kingdoms emerged, with Norse rulers like Olaf the White controlling large portions of Ireland. The Viking influence in Scotland. The Vikings settled in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, integrating with local Pictish and Gaelic cultures. Norse warriors fought both for and against Scottish clans, often playing a major role in power struggles. The Viking Earls of Orkney remained semi-independent from both Scotland and Norway for centuries. Viking settlements in Ireland and Scotland lasted longer than their rule in England, with Norse influence still visible in place names, traditions, and genetics today. 3. The Norman connection, Vikings in France. One of the most successful Viking conquests came not from direct warfare, but through negotiation and settlement. The Viking siege of Paris, 885 to 886 AD. In 885 AD, a massive Viking fleet of 700 ships sailed up the Seine River and besieged Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Fat, was unable to stop them and paid them off with silver. Instead of leaving, the Vikings continued raiding deeper into France, proving that paying them off was not a long-term solution. The creation of Normandy, 911 AD. After decades of Viking raids, the French king, Charles the Simple, made a historic agreement with the Viking leader Rollo. In 911 AD, Rollo was granted land in northern France, which became known as Normandy, meaning land of the Northmen. In exchange, Rollo swore loyalty to the Frankish king and converted to Christianity. How the Vikings became the Normans. Over time, the Norse settlers adopted the French language and customs, creating the Normans, a powerful warrior culture that would later invade England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. The Norman conquest of England, 1066 AD, was essentially a Viking legacy, as William was a direct descendant of Rollo. The Vikings may have disappeared from France as raiders, but they survived as rulers, eventually shaping the future of Europe. 4. Viking expansion into Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus. While Viking expansion in Western Europe is well known, their influence in Eastern Europe was just as significant. The rise of the Rus, 9th to 10th century. Norse traders and warriors, known as the Varangians, sailed deep into Russia and Ukraine, using rivers like the Dnieper and Volga. They established major trade cities, including Novgorod and Kiev, which became the foundation of Kievan Rus, the state that later evolved into modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Viking-Byzantine connection. The Vikings became important trade partners and mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. Many Viking warriors joined the Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors. Though the Norse influence in Eastern Europe eventually faded, they left behind lasting dynasties. Even the name Russia is believed to come from the Norse word Rus. 5. The end of Viking conquests, 11th century. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was coming to an end. The reasons for their decline included the rise of centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the spread of Christianity, which discouraged raiding and pagan warrior traditions, stronger European defenses, including castles and standing armies, the Norman conquest of England, 1066 AD, which marked the last great Viking campaign. Despite their decline as raiders and conquerors, the Vikings had already changed Europe forever. Their descendants ruled England, Normans, Russia, Kievan Rus, and parts of France, Normandy, leaving a legacy of exploration, warfare, and cultural influence. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were nation builders and kings, shaping Europe through their conquests and settlements. They ruled parts of England under the Danelaw. They created Ireland's first major cities. They became dukes in Normandy and later kings of England. They founded trade cities in Russia that still exist today. Their military campaigns left a permanent mark on world history, proving that the Viking Age was about more than just plunder. It was about power, influence, and lasting change. While Vikings were famous for their raids and conquests, their daily lives were centered around farming, trade, family, and tradition. They were not just warriors, they were skilled craftsmen, traders, poets, farmers, and seafarers, building a complex society that thrived for centuries. This section explores how Vikings lived, worked, ate, entertained themselves, and structured their society in their homelands of Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and their settlements abroad. Viking society and social structure. Viking society was structured, yet flexible, allowing people to rise or fall in status through wealth, achievements, and alliances. While some were mighty warriors or powerful chieftains, most Vikings were farmers, traders, and craftsmen, contributing to their communities in various ways. Social classes in Viking society. Vikings divided their society into three broad groups. 1. Jarls, nobles and chieftains. The highest class, consisting of wealthy rulers, warlords, and powerful landowners. Jarls controlled large estates and commanded warriors, sometimes acting as local kings. They lived in large longhouses, held feasts, and built alliances through marriage and gifts. A successful warrior could rise to become a jarl, but losing wealth or influence could mean falling in status. 2. Cols, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. The majority of Vikings were cols, free men and women who worked as farmers, blacksmiths, traders, and warriors. Cols owned small farms, raising livestock and crops, and many took part in seasonal raiding or trading voyages. They paid taxes or service to a jarl in exchange for protection and land. 3. Thralls, slaves and servants. Thralls were the lowest class, consisting of enslaved people captured in raids or born into servitude. Slaves worked as laborious, servants, or craftsmen, and while they had few rights, some could buy their freedom. Slavery was a major part of Viking economy, with many being sold in markets across Europe and the Middle East. Despite this hierarchy, Viking society was more flexible than many medieval cultures. A common carl could rise to wealth and power if successful, and thralls could earn freedom over time. Family life and gender roles. The Viking household was multi-generational, with parents, children, and extended family often living together in a longhouse. A household could also include thralls, slaves, who helped with farming, cooking, and other duties. Families worked as a unit, with men, women, and children each contributing to daily life. Houses were built from wood, stone, or turf, depending on the available materials. The central hearth was the heart of the home, providing heat, light, and a place to cook. The role of women. Viking women had more rights and freedoms than most other medieval European women. They could own land, inherit property, and file for divorce. Many women ran farms and households, especially while men were away on raids or trade journeys. Some women, called shield maidens, were said to have fought alongside men, though historical evidence is debated. The most powerful women acted as priestesses, volva, or business owners, controlling trade and managing wealth. Marriage was often a practical arrangement, used to form alliances and secure property, though divorce was possible if a marriage failed. Childhood and education. Viking children were expected to contribute to work from a young age. Boys learned farming, combat, and craftsmanship from their fathers. Girls were taught household skills, weaving, and managing farms from their mothers. Education was informal, passed down through oral storytelling, runes, and hands-on training. Children were not treated as fragile. They participated in games, sports, and even mock battles to prepare for adulthood. Viking culture placed a strong emphasis on honor, loyalty, and strength, teaching these values from childhood. Work, trade, and economy. Farming, the backbone of Viking society. Most Vikings were farmers, relying on agriculture to support their families. They raised crops, barley, oats, rye, wheat, and vegetables. Livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens. Fishing and hunting were also crucial, especially in coastal settlements. Farms varied from small family plots to large estates controlled by jarls, with thralls, slaves, working the land. Trade and commerce. Vikings were exceptional traders, traveling as far as Byzantium, Persia, and even Central Asia. Major Viking trade goods included amber, furs, and walrus ivory from the north, weapons and ironwork from Scandinavia, silk, spices, and silver coins from the Middle East and Byzantium, slaves, captured in raids and sold in markets across Europe and the Islamic world. Cities like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin became major Viking trade centers, where merchants from all over the world gathered. Food and drink. What Vikings ate. Viking meals were simple but hearty, consisting of bread, dairy, meat, and vegetables. Meat, pork, beef, lamb, fish, and wild game. Dairy, milk, cheese, butter, and skyr, a yogurt-like food. Bread, made from rye or barley, often coarse and dense. Vegetables, cabbage, onions, carrots, and turnips. Fruits, apples, berries, and nuts. Drinks, mead, ale, and fermented drinks. Vikings loved drinking mead, honey wine, ale, and fruit-based wines. Mead was reserved for feasts and special occasions. Ale was the daily drink, even for children, since it was safer than water. Drinking horns and wooden cups were used to serve drinks at gatherings and celebrations. Entertainment and games. Vikings had a rich cultural life, filled with storytelling, music, games, and competitions. Storytelling and poetry. Vikings had no written history, stories were passed down through oral tradition. Skalds, poets, memorized and recited sagas about gods, heroes, and Viking ancestors. Runes were used for short inscriptions, but most Viking culture was preserved through spoken word. Games and sports. Vikings enjoyed physical competitions, testing their strength and skill in various ways. Onifatafl, a popular Viking board game, similar to chess. Wrestling, a common sport to prove strength and endurance. Archery and spear throwing, important for both warriors and hunters. Horse racing and swimming, popular among both men and women. Many Viking celebrations included competitive games and challenges, strengthening bonds within the community. While Vikings were often seen as raiders and warriors, their daily lives were centered around farming, family, trade, and tradition. Their society was structured but flexible, allowing people to rise in status through skill and bravery. Women had unusual freedoms compared to other medieval cultures. Vikings were skilled traders and craftsmen, connecting Scandinavia to Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Food, drink, and entertainment were key to their way of life, fostering strong community bonds. The Viking Age, spanning from approximately 793 to 1066 AD, was a time of exploration, conquest, and cultural transformation. For nearly 3 centuries, Norse warriors, traders, and settlers influenced vast parts of Europe, from the shores of England and Ireland to the rivers of Russia and the gates of Byzantium. However, by the mid-11th century, Viking power had begun to fade. The decline of the Viking Age was not caused by a single event, but rather a combination of political, religious, and military changes that reshaped Scandinavia and the lands the Vikings had once dominated. This section explores the key reasons behind the fall of the Viking era and how Scandinavian societies evolved in its aftermath. In the early Viking Age, most of Europe was fragmented into small, often weak kingdoms that were easy targets for Viking raids. However, by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, many of these territories had strengthened their defenses, making Viking raids more difficult. In England, Viking power had peaked with the establishment of the Danelaw, where Norse rulers controlled large parts of the country. However, Anglo-Saxon resistance, particularly under King Alfred the Great, 871 to 899 AD, began to push back against Viking rule. By 954 AD, the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was defeated, officially ending Viking rule in northern England. Over time, England became a stronger, more unified kingdom, with rulers like King Athelstan and Edward the Confessor building a more stable and centralized state, making large-scale Viking invasions far more difficult. A similar situation unfolded in France. After years of Viking attacks, the Frankish king made a historic agreement in 911 AD with the Viking leader Rollo, granting him land in northern France. This territory became Normandy, meaning land of the Northmen. Over generations, these Norse settlers adopted the French language and customs, eventually transforming into the powerful Normans. The Normans would later become one of the dominant military forces in Europe, culminating in their conquest of England in 1066, effectively ending the Viking Age. One of the most significant factors in the decline of Viking traditions was the spread of Christianity, which replaced pagan warrior culture with new religious and political structures. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Christian missionaries, supported by European rulers, converted many Scandinavian kings. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was one of the first rulers to convert, marking the beginning of the Christian era in Scandinavia. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason and King Olaf II, Street Olaf, enforced Christianity through violent means, destroying pagan temples and punishing those who resisted conversion. Sweden took longer to fully convert, but by the mid-11th century, most of Scandinavia had adopted Christianity, and Viking-era pagan traditions were slowly fading. As Christianity spread, many core Viking beliefs and traditions changed. The Old Norse gods Odin, Thor, and Freyja were replaced with Christian saints. Human sacrifices and temple rituals were outlawed. Viking warriors were no longer encouraged to die in battle for Valhalla, but instead to seek salvation in Christian heaven. Even Viking burial customs changed, with ship burials and cremations being replaced by Christian-style graves. Christianity also introduced new laws, social structures, and political alliances, aligning Scandinavian rulers with the larger Christian kingdoms of Europe. As a result, Viking-style raiding and warfare became less common, gradually transforming the Norse world into one of settled monarchies and Christian nations. By the 11th century, Viking raids became less frequent, and several factors contributed to this decline. The rise of fortified cities, stone castles, and professional armies in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire made it much harder for Viking warbands to plunder effectively. Monasteries, once easy targets, were now protected by walls and local militias, meaning Vikings had to face greater risks for less reward. At the same time, Scandinavians were becoming settlers rather than raiders. Many Norsemen had already established permanent settlements in England, Normandy, Russia, and Ireland, integrating into local cultures. The Viking economy also shifted. Trade became more important than plundering, as Scandinavian merchants formed strong economic connections with Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Over time, many Viking warriors found new roles as mercenaries, landowners, or traders, rather than continuing to raid foreign shores. Although Viking influence had already declined by the mid-11th century, two major battles are often considered the official end of the Viking Age. In 1066, the legendary Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking warriors, launched an invasion of England. His forces landed in the north, but at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the English army led by Harold Godwinson crushed the Viking forces. Hardrada himself was killed, and the Viking army was nearly annihilated. This was one of the last major Viking invasions of Europe, marking the end of large-scale Norse warfare. Just weeks later, England faced another invasion, this time from William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Viking settlers. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated the English army, taking control of England. This event symbolized the final transformation of Viking power. The Normans, once Vikings themselves, had evolved into Christianized European rulers, bringing the Viking Age to a definitive close. The legacy of the Vikings. Although the Viking Age ended, its impact on Europe and the world remained strong. In Scandinavia, the former Viking territories evolved into structured Christian monarchies, laying the foundations for modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Kings who once led Viking raids now ruled over centralized kingdoms, strengthening diplomatic ties with the rest of Europe. The Viking influence on language and culture remained strong. In England, hundreds of Norse words entered the English language, including words like sky, egg, knife, window, and husband. Viking place names are still found across England, Scotland, and Ireland, especially in regions once controlled by the Danelaw. In France, The Normans, descendants of Vikings, became one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe. They ruled England, southern Italy, and Sicily, and played a key role in the Crusades, spreading Viking influence even further. Beyond Europe, Viking exploration and settlements also left a lasting impact. Iceland and Greenland remained Viking strongholds for centuries, and Norse explorers were the first Europeans to reach North America. Though their settlements in Vinland did not last, archaeological discoveries like Elant's auxiliary meadows prove that Vikings reached the New World nearly 500 years before Columbus. The Viking Age ended not because of a single event, but through gradual transformation. Stronger European kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, economic changes, and military defeats all played a role in the decline of Norse dominance. By 1066, Viking power had faded, but their legacy lived on through their influence on language, culture, exploration, and history. The warrior raiders of Scandinavia became kings, settlers, and traders, shaping the future of Europe in ways that lasted far beyond their time. Even though the Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, the fascination with their culture, myths, and way of life continues to this day. While the Vikings are best known for their raids, conquests, and mythology, there are many fascinating details about their lives that are often overlooked. Here are some lesser-known and fun Viking facts that highlight their unique culture and daily life. Vikings were extremely hygienic. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, Vikings were surprisingly clean compared to many medieval Europeans. They bathed at least once a week, which was far more frequent than most people of their time. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, razors, and even ear cleaners in Viking settlements, proving that personal grooming was important to them. They didn't wear horned helmets. The iconic horned Viking helmet is actually a myth created in the 19th century by artists and opera designers. Real Viking helmets were simple, rounded, and made of iron or leather, designed for protection in battle. The idea of horned helmets likely came from Germanic and Celtic ceremonial headdresses, rather than Viking warriors. Vikings had laws for personal honor. The Viking legal system was highly developed, with laws focused on honor, reputation, and fairness. Disputes were settled at local assemblies called things, where free men could argue their cases before a council. If someone was found guilty of serious crimes, they could be banished, outlawed, fined, or even executed. Honor was so important that insults could lead to legal duels, where combat determined the winner of a dispute. They had a unique sense of humor. Vikings enjoyed jokes, riddles, and sarcasm, often using wordplay in insults and storytelling. Many Viking sagas contain dark humor, with warriors making jokes even in the face of death. For example, the famous Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok, according to legend, laughed as he was thrown into a pit of snakes, making a final boast before dying. They used a special liquid to start fires. Vikings were skilled at fire starting, using a unique method to make flames quickly. They would boil fungus, called touchwood, in urine, which contained chemicals that made it highly flammable. This allowed them to carry fire-starting material on long voyages, ensuring they could easily make campfires anywhere. Viking women had more rights than most medieval women. Unlike many other societies of the time, Viking women had the right to own land, divorce their husbands, and reclaim their dowries. Some women even became powerful merchants, landowners, and warriors. The sagas also mention shield maidens, women who fought in battle alongside men, though their historical existence is debated. They traveled to more places than most people realize. Vikings reached North America, Vinland, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa through their extensive trade networks. Norse artifacts have been found as far away as Iran, India, and China, showing just how far Viking traders traveled. They were not just warriors but also diplomats, explorers, and skilled merchants. The Vikings were much more than just raiders. They were innovative, humorous, and surprisingly sophisticated in many aspects of life. From hygiene and humor to fire-starting techniques and long-distance trade, their culture was filled with fascinating details that still capture our interest today. The Viking Age may have ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but its legacy lives on in history, language, and culture. From fearsome warriors and legendary explorers to skilled traders and storytellers, The Vikings left their mark on the world in ways few civilizations have. Their myths, traditions, and achievements continue to fascinate and inspire us today, proving that the spirit of the Norsemen is far from forgotten.